Callum Quinn's stomach growled so loudly that the elderly woman standing next to him at the market square turned to stare, and he felt heat crawl up his neck as he pretended not to notice. His eyes fixed on the notice board where a single weathered parchment fluttered in the autumn breeze. He had been in Millhaven for 3 days now, sleeping in the stable of an inn whose owner had taken pity on him after he had spent his last copper on a heel of stale bread. And if he did not find work soon, he would have to move on to the next town with nothing but the worn clothes on his back and boots that were developing holes in the soles. The notice was simple, written in surprisingly neat script. Farmhand needed. Hard work, fair pay. Ask for Grenna at the Thornwood farm, 2 miles east past the old mill. Callum pulled the notice from the board before anyone else could claim it, ignoring the looks from the townspeople who had gathered in the square for the morning market, and set off down the eastern road with what little dignity his empty stomach would allow. The day was cool and overcast, with the kind of gray sky that promised rain before nightfall, and the wind carried the scent of smoke from chimneys and the earthy smell of autumn leaves. He walked past the old mill, its water wheel creaking in the gentle current, and continued along a rutted dirt path that wound through fields of harvested grain and pastures, where cattle grazed behind split-rail fences. The farmhouse appeared around a bend in the road, a solid structure of dark timber and stone with a steep roof and a chimney from which smoke rose in a steady column. The barn beside it was larger than most Callum had seen, built to accommodate serious livestock, and the fields surrounding the property were extensive and well-maintained despite the late season. What struck him most, however, was the figure working near the barn, lifting bales of hay as though they weighed nothing and stacking them with efficient precision. She was an orc. Callum stopped walking, his hand instinctively moving to his belt where a weapon would have hung if he had owned one, but he forced himself to remain still and observe. She was tall, easily 6 feet, with broad shoulders and arms that showed lean muscle beneath skin the color of spring leaves. Her black hair was tied back in a thick braid that fell past her shoulder blades, and when she turned slightly, he could see the small tusks that jutted from her lower jaw, white against her green skin. She wore practical clothing, a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark trousers and heavy boots caked with mud. He must have made some sound, or perhaps she simply sensed his presence, because she turned fully to face him, and Callum found himself looking into eyes the color of amber. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the yard, and he became acutely aware of how vulnerable he was, alone and unarmed on an isolated farm with an orc who could probably break him in half without much effort. "You are here about the notice," she said, and her voice was deeper than a human woman's but not unpleasant, carrying clearly across the distance between them. Callum swallowed and held up the parchment. "I am. Are you Grenna?" "I am." She set down the bale she had been holding and walked toward him, her gait confident and unhurried. As she drew closer, Callum could see more details: the slight point to her ears, the defined line of her jaw, the way her amber eyes assessed him with what seemed like equal parts wariness and curiosity. "You do not look like much of a farmhand." "I am stronger than I look," Callum said, which was not entirely true but not entirely false either. He had worked on his uncle's farm as a boy before the old man had died and left nothing but debts, and he had spent the last 2 years doing whatever labor he could find as he drifted from town to town. "I can plow, plant, harvest, mend fences, tend animals, whatever you need." Grenna crossed her arms over her chest, her expression skeptical. "When did you last eat?" The question caught him off guard, and he hesitated too long before answering. "Yesterday morning." "You are lying. It has been longer." She turned and walked toward the farmhouse, gesturing for him to follow. "Come, we will discuss terms after you have eaten." Callum's pride wanted him to refuse, to insist that he was fine and could start work immediately. But his stomach had other ideas, and he found himself trailing after her like a half-starved dog. The inside of the farmhouse was warm and surprisingly comfortable, with a large hearth where a fire crackled cheerfully, solid wooden furniture that looked handmade, and shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables and dried herbs. Grenna gestured for him to sit at the table while she moved to the hearth, where a pot of something that smelled absolutely divine was simmering over the flames. She ladled a generous portion into a bowl and set it before him along with a thick slice of dark bread and a wedge of cheese. "Eat slowly. If your stomach is as empty as I think, you will make yourself sick otherwise." Callum wanted to devour everything in front of him, but he forced himself to heed her advice, taking small bites of the stew and letting the warmth of it spread through his chest. It was venison, he realized, with root vegetables and herbs, seasoned perfectly and cooked until the meat fell apart at the touch of his spoon. He could not remember the last time he had eaten something so good, and he had to blink back the sting of tears that threatened to embarrass him. Grenna sat across from him, watching him eat with an expression that was difficult to read. "You are human," she said, as if this were not obvious. "Why would you want to work for an orc?" "I need work," Callum said honestly. "The notice did not mention that you were an orc, but even if it had, I would still be here. I cannot afford to be particular. Most humans would rather starve than accept help from my kind. Most humans are fools." The words came out more forcefully than he had intended, and Grenna's eyebrows rose slightly. Callum set down his spoon and met her gaze. "I have worked alongside orcs before, during the war when I was young and stupid enough to believe I could make a difference. We fought together, bled together. I learned that honor and decency are not determined by the color of your skin or the shape of your teeth." Something shifted in Grenna's expression, a softening around her eyes that made her look less guarded. "You are a veteran then." "I was. I am not anymore. Now I am just a man looking for honest work." Grenna was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The work here is hard. I run this farm alone and there is much to do before winter arrives. I need someone who can help with the harvest, repair the barn roof, chop and stack firewood, and prepare the animals for the cold months. The pay is 2 silver pieces per week, with room and board included. You will sleep in the loft above the barn, and you will eat your meals here in the house. I expect you to work from dawn until dusk, with 1 day of rest per week." 2 silver pieces per week was more than generous for farmhand work, and Callum felt a flicker of suspicion. "Why are you offering so much? Most farmers pay half that." "Because I am an orc, and no one from the town will work for me no matter how much I offer," Grenna said bluntly. "You are desperate enough to accept, and I am desperate enough to hire you despite your obvious lack of proper meals recently. Do we have an agreement?" Callum extended his hand across the table. "We do." Grenna's hand engulfed his, her grip firm and warm, and for a moment Callum felt the strange sensation that he had just made a decision that would change the course of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. Then the moment passed, and Grenna released his hand and stood, moving to clear away his empty bowl. "Finish your bread and cheese," she said. "Then I will show you where you will be sleeping and what needs to be done." The loft above the barn was simple but clean, with a straw mattress, a wool blanket, and a small window that overlooked the fields. It was more than Callum had hoped for, and after Grenna left him to settle in, he lay down on the mattress and stared up at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling, feeling the first real spark of hope he had experienced in months. He had work, shelter, and food. And if his employer happened to be an orc woman with amber eyes and a surprisingly kind heart, well, he had dealt with stranger situations during the war. He fell asleep to the sound of rain beginning to patter against the roof, and when he woke the next morning to the gray light of dawn, he found a clean shirt and trousers folded neatly at the foot of the ladder leading down from the loft. They were too large for him, clearly made for someone of Grenna's size, but they were clean and free of holes, which was more than he could say for his current clothing. He changed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and cuffs, and climbed down to find Grenna already working in the barn, mucking out stalls with focused efficiency. "You are awake," she said without looking up. "There is breakfast in the house when you are ready. After you eat, you will help me finish here, and then we will begin work on the barn roof." The routine that developed over the following days was grueling but satisfying. Callum worked harder than he had in years, his muscles aching and his hands developing fresh calluses. But each night he fell into his straw mattress with the bone-deep satisfaction of having accomplished something real. Grenna was a demanding employer, but not an unfair one, and she worked alongside him rather than simply directing from a distance. He learned that she had inherited the farm from her father, who had been one of the first orcs to settle in the region after the war, and that she had been running it alone for 3 years since his death. She did not speak much about herself, and Callum did not press, focusing instead on learning the rhythms of the farm and proving that he could handle whatever tasks she set before him. They worked in companionable silence most days, with only brief exchanges about what needed to be done or how best to approach a particular problem. It was during these quiet moments that Callum began to notice small things about Grenna. The way she hummed softly to herself when she thought no one was listening, the careful gentleness with which she handled the animals despite her strength, the slight smile that would sometimes touch her lips when something amused her. At the end of the first week, Grenna paid him exactly what she had promised, counting out 2 silver pieces and placing them in his palm with a nod of approval. "You have worked well. I am pleased." Callum stared at the coins, then looked up at her with confusion. "This is too much. You said 2 silver per week, but you have also been feeding me better than I have eaten in years and gave me new clothes. You should deduct those costs from my wages." Grenna shook her head. "I said 2 silver per week with room and board. That includes meals and whatever else you need to do your work properly. Those clothes were my father's, and they were doing no good sitting in a trunk. Keep your wages. At least let me buy supplies when I go into town for my day off tomorrow," Callum insisted. "If there is anything you need from the market." Something flickered across Grenna's face, an expression too quick for Callum to identify. "I do not go into town," she said quietly. "The people there have made it clear that my coin is not welcome in their shops." Callum felt a surge of anger on her behalf, remembering the looks the townspeople had given him when he had pulled the notice from the board, the whispers that had followed him as he left the square. "Then I will go for you. Give me a list of what you need and I will get it. They will not sell to you either if they know it is for me. Then I will not tell them." Callum met her gaze steadily. "You are paying me fairly for my work, Grenna. The least I can do is make sure you have what you need from town." For a long moment, Grenna simply looked at him, her amber eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he meant what he said. Then she nodded slowly. "Very well. I will prepare a list." The next morning, Callum set out for Millhaven with a detailed list in his pocket and a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. The walk took less than an hour, and he arrived to find the market square already bustling with activity. He moved through the stalls methodically, purchasing flour, sugar, salt, and various other supplies that Grenna had requested. and he was careful to give no indication that he was buying for anyone other than himself. Most of the vendors were happy enough to take his coin, but he noticed the way some of them looked at him, their expressions curious and slightly suspicious. It was at the fabric merchant's stall that he encountered real trouble. He was examining a bolt of sturdy wool that would be perfect for winter clothing when a voice behind him said, "I hear you are working out at the Thornwood farm." Callum turned to find a man in his 40s watching him with narrowed eyes, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. Two other men flanked him, both wearing expressions of barely concealed hostility. "I am," Callum said evenly. "Is that a problem?" "Depends on your perspective," the man said. "Some of us think it is a problem when a human chooses to work for a greenskin instead of accepting honest work from his own kind. I was offered honest work, and I accepted it. I do not see how that concerns you." "It concerns all of us when someone gives aid and comfort to creatures that killed our friends and family during the war." The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "That orc's father was a raider before he settled here. He probably slaughtered dozens of good humans before deciding to play at being a farmer, and now his daughter is reaping the benefits of his blood money." Callum felt his hands curl into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. "The war is over. It has been over for years. If you cannot let go of your hatred, that is your burden to carry, but do not expect me to share it." "Careful, boy," one of the other men said. "You are new here. You do not understand how things work." "I understand perfectly," Callum said coldly. "You are bullies who would rather nurse old grudges than move forward with your lives. Now, if you will excuse me, I have shopping to finish." He turned his back on them, which was probably a mistake, but he refused to be intimidated. The fabric merchant, who had been watching the exchange with obvious discomfort, quickly cut the length of wool Callum requested and wrapped it in brown paper, accepting payment with nervous haste. Callum gathered his purchases and left the square without further incident, but he could feel hostile eyes on him the entire way, and he knew that his association with Grenna had marked him as an outsider in Millhaven. When he returned to the farm, Grenna was working in the vegetable garden, pulling up the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze. She looked up as he approached, and her expression shifted to concern when she saw his face. "What happened?" "Nothing," Callum said, but the lie was transparent even to him. Grenna set down her basket and stood, wiping dirt from her hands. "Tell me." So he did, recounting the confrontation in the market square and the accusations the men had thrown at him. Grenna listened without interruption, her expression growing more closed with each word, and when he finished, she was silent for a long moment. "My father was not a raider," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "He was a soldier, yes, and he fought in the war because that was what his clan demanded of him. But when the war ended, he chose peace. He came here with nothing but his savings and his skills, and he built this farm from bare land. He traded fairly with the townspeople, paid his taxes, helped his neighbors when they needed it, and they hated him anyway because he was an orc, and that was all they could see." "I am sorry," Callum said quietly. "Do not apologize. You defended me to them, which is more than I expected." Grenna turned back to her garden, kneeling to resume her work. "But you should know that working here will make you an outcast in Millhaven. If you wish to leave, I will understand." Callum set down his bags and moved to kneel beside her, pulling up carrots and shaking the dirt from their roots. "I am not leaving. You gave me work when I was starving, and you have treated me with more decency than most humans I have encountered in the past 2 years. If the people in town want to hate me for that, let them." Grenna's hands stilled in the dirt, and when she looked at him, there was something in her eyes that made Callum's breath catch. "You are a strange human, Callum Quinn." "I have been told that before," he said, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile. The weeks that followed brought a deepening of their working relationship into something that resembled friendship. Callum learned more about Grenna's past, about the mother she had lost to illness when she was young, about the struggles her father had faced trying to build a life in a place that did not want him. In turn, he shared stories of his own childhood, of the uncle who had raised him and taught him the value of hard work, of the years he had spent wandering after the war had ended, and he had found himself unable to settle back into ordinary life. They worked together to prepare the farm for winter, chopping and stacking cords of firewood, repairing fences and buildings, and putting up preserves from the last of the harvest. Grenna was an excellent cook, and the meals they shared in the farmhouse kitchen became something Callum looked forward to, a time of warmth and companionship that contrasted sharply with the cold loneliness of his previous existence. He found himself watching her when she was not looking, noticing the way firelight brought out golden tones in her green skin, the surprising grace of her movements, the sound of her laugh when he managed to say something that amused her. It was a dangerous path his thoughts were taking, and he knew it. Grenna was his employer, and more than that, she was an orc in a world that looked upon such relationships with disgust and horror. But knowing that his growing attraction was foolish did nothing to diminish it, and there were moments when he caught her looking at him with an expression he could not quite read that made him wonder if perhaps she felt something similar. The first snow came in late November, a light dusting that transformed the farm into something out of a painting. Callum woke to find the world white and quiet, and he dressed quickly in the warm clothes Grenna had provided, eager to begin the day's work. They spent the morning tending to the animals and making sure all the buildings were secure against the weather, and by midday, the snow had stopped and the sun had emerged, turning everything bright and crystalline. "Come," Grenna said, gesturing for him to follow her. "There is something I want to show you." She led him through the fields to a place where the land rose slightly, forming a small hill that overlooked the farm and the countryside beyond. From this vantage point, Callum could see the smoke rising from distant chimneys, the ribbon of the river winding through the valley, the dark line of forest on the horizon. It was beautiful in a stark, winter way, and he stood beside Grenna in companionable silence, simply taking in the view. "My father brought me here when I was young," Grenna said quietly. "He told me that this was our land, our home, and that no one could take it from us as long as we were willing to fight for it. I did not understand then what he meant, that the fight would not be with swords and spears but with simple persistence, with the daily choice to remain despite everything that told us we should leave." "He sounds like he was a wise man," Callum said. "He was. And stubborn. I inherited that from him." She turned to look at Callum, and there was something vulnerable in her expression that he had never seen before. "I am glad you stayed, Callum. I do not think I realized how lonely I had become until you arrived." Callum's heart was pounding in his chest, and he knew he was standing at a precipice, that what he said next would matter more than almost anything he had said before. "I am glad I stayed too. This place, working here with you, it feels more like home than anywhere I have been in years." Grenna's eyes searched his face, and for a moment, Callum thought she might say something more, might acknowledge the thing that was growing between them. But then she turned away, her shoulders straightening as if she were bracing herself against something. "We should get back. There is still work to be done before dark." The moment passed, but it left Callum with a strange mixture of hope and frustration that stayed with him through the rest of the day and into the evening. That night, lying in his loft and listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the barn walls, he made a decision. He was tired of pretending that what he felt for Grenna was merely gratitude or friendship. He was falling in love with her, had probably been falling in love with her since the day she had fed him stew and given him a chance when no one else would. The question was what, if anything, he should do about it. December brought harsher weather and shorter days, and the work shifted from outdoor tasks to maintenance and preparation for spring. Callum spent hours in the barn repairing tools, treating leather and organizing supplies, while Grenna worked on various projects in the farmhouse. They still took their meals together, and Callum treasured these times, the quiet conversations over bread and stew, the comfortable silences broken only by the crackle of the fire. It was during one of these meals that Grenna mentioned she would be traveling to a larger town, 2 days' journey away, to sell some of her goods and purchase supplies she could not get in Millhaven. "I will be gone for perhaps a week," she said. "I trust you to look after the farm while I am away." "Of course," Callum said, though the thought of a week without her company left him feeling strangely bereft. "Is there anything in particular you need me to do?" "Just the usual tasks. Feed the animals, keep the fires going, make sure nothing falls apart." She paused, then added, "You could come with me if you wanted. The journey is long but not dangerous, and the town I am going to is more accepting of orcs." Callum considered this, tempted by the prospect of more time with Grenna, but also aware that leaving the farm unattended for a week was risky. "I should stay here. Someone needs to watch over things, and you will travel faster alone anyway." Grenna nodded, though Callum thought he detected a hint of disappointment in her expression. "Very well. I will leave the day after tomorrow." The day of her departure dawned cold and clear, and Callum helped her load her wagon with the goods she planned to sell. Preserved vegetables, smoked meats, finely crafted tools that she had made during the long winter evenings. She had packed supplies for the journey and dressed warmly, her breath misting in the frigid air as she checked the harness on her horse one final time. "Be safe," Callum said, and the words felt inadequate for what he actually wanted to say. Grenna looked at him for a long moment, and then, to his surprise, she reached out and squeezed his shoulder briefly. "You as well. I will return as soon as I can." He watched her wagon disappear down the road, and then he turned back to the farm, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. The days that followed were strange and quiet, and Callum found himself talking to the animals more than usual, simply to hear a voice other than his own. He maintained the farm meticulously, determined to prove that Grenna's trust in him was not misplaced, and he counted the days until her return like a miser counting coins. On the 5th day, a storm rolled in from the north, bringing howling winds and snow that fell so thickly Callum could barely see the barn from the farmhouse. He spent the day making sure the animals were secure and warm, then retreated to the farmhouse to wait out the weather. The fire in the hearth provided light and heat, but the house felt too large and too empty without Grenna's presence, and Callum found himself wondering if she had been caught in the storm, if she was safe. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day, and when it finally cleared, Callum woke to find nearly 2 feet of fresh snow blanketing everything. He spent the morning digging paths between the buildings and making sure none of the structures had been damaged, and he was shoveling snow away from the barn doors when he heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Grenna was back. She looked exhausted, her face pale beneath the green of her skin, and there was a tension in her shoulders that spoke of a difficult journey. Callum hurried to help her down from the wagon, and he was alarmed to feel her trembling slightly beneath his hands. "You are freezing." "Come inside, I will tend to the horse and unload the wagon." "I can help," Grenna protested, but her voice was weak. "You can help by getting warm. Please, Grenna, Let me do this." She must have been more tired than he realized because she did not argue further, simply nodded and made her way slowly to the farmhouse. Callum worked quickly, unhitching the horse and leading it into the barn, rubbing it down and making sure it had food and water. The wagon was still partially loaded, and he brought the remaining supplies into the farmhouse, stacking them neatly near the door. He found Grenna sitting close to the fire, wrapped in a blanket, and he could see now that she was not just tired but unwell. Her eyes were too bright, and when he placed a hand on her forehead, her skin was hot to the touch. "You have a fever." "It is nothing," Grenna said, but even as she spoke, she swayed slightly where she sat. "It is not nothing. When did this start?" "2 days ago. I thought it would pass, but the storm made the journey back difficult, and I think I pushed myself too hard." Callum felt a surge of worry mixed with frustration. "You should have stayed in town until you felt better." "I wanted to come home," Grenna said softly, and something in the way she said it made Callum's throat tighten. "All right. You are home now and you are going to rest. I will make you some broth and tea and you are not to argue with me." Grenna managed a weak smile. "I would not dare." Over the next 3 days, Callum divided his time between caring for the farm and caring for Grenna. He prepared simple meals of broth and porridge, brewed medicinal teas from the herbs she kept in the kitchen, and made sure she stayed warm and hydrated. The fever broke on the 3rd day, and Grenna's color began to return, though she was still weak and tired easily. "You did not have to do this," she said one evening as Callum brought her a bowl of stew, the first solid food she had been able to stomach. "Yes, I did," Callum said simply. "You took care of me when I needed it. This is me returning the favor." Grenna was silent for a moment, her amber eyes fixed on his face. "It is more than that, though, is it not?" Callum's heart stuttered in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I am not blind, Callum, nor am I foolish. I have seen the way you look at me, and I would be lying if I said I did not feel something similar." Her voice was quiet but steady. "But we both know that what lies between us is complicated. Humans and orcs, we are not meant to be together in the eyes of either of our peoples." "I do not care what other people think," Callum said, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. "Grenna, these past months working beside you, living here, they have been the happiest I have known in years. You are strong and kind and honorable, and I find myself thinking about you constantly, wishing I had the right to stand beside you as something more than just your employee. Callum, I know I am just a human, and I know I have nothing to offer you but my labor and my loyalty, but I need you to know how I feel. I am in love with you, Grenna. I have been for weeks now, maybe longer." The silence that followed was agonizing, and Callum braced himself for rejection, for the gentle explanation that what he wanted was impossible. But then Grenna reached out and took his hand, her grip strong despite her recent illness. "I am in love with you too," she said, and her voice was shaking slightly. "I have been fighting it, telling myself that it was foolish and dangerous and would only lead to pain. But when I was traveling back through that storm, all I could think about was getting home to you, seeing your face again. And when you cared for me these past days, I realized that I do not want to fight what I feel anymore." Callum felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. "You mean it. I do not say things I do not mean." Grenna's thumb brushed across his knuckles, a gesture so tender it made his eyes sting. "But you need to understand what choosing this path will mean. The people in Millhaven already dislike you for working here. If they learn that we are together, truly together, they will do worse than dislike you. You could be ostracized, attacked, driven from the region entirely." "Then we will face it together," Callum said firmly. "I am not afraid of them, Grenna. I am only afraid of losing you." Grenna's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she pulled him closer, wrapping her arms around him in an embrace that felt like coming home. Callum held her carefully, mindful of her lingering weakness, and breathed in the scent of her, herbs and wood smoke and something uniquely her. They stayed like that for a long time, neither speaking, simply taking comfort in each other's presence. When they finally pulled apart, Grenna was smiling, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "I think we should take things slowly," she said. "Figure out what this means for us, how we want to move forward." "Agreed," Callum said, though part of him wanted to rush ahead, to claim every moment of happiness they could find. But Grenna was right that they needed to be careful to think about the future and what shape it might take. Over the following weeks, as Grenna regained her strength and the winter settled in fully, their relationship shifted and deepened. They were more open with each other now, sharing not just their days but their hopes and fears, their dreams for the future. Grenna spoke of her desire to expand the farm, to perhaps take on apprentices and teach them her father's skills. Callum talked about his wish to build something lasting, to have a place he could truly call home. They were careful about physical affection, both aware that what was growing between them was precious and worth protecting. But there were moments, brief and sweet, when Grenna would brush her fingers through his hair as she passed, or Callum would rest his hand on her back as they worked side by side, and these small touches felt more intimate than anything he had experienced before. It was in early January that the trouble started. Callum had gone into Millhaven for supplies, something he did less frequently now but still occasionally necessary, and he had just finished his shopping when he encountered the same group of men who had confronted him months earlier. This time, however, they were not content with words. "Still working for the greenskin, I see," the leader said, his tone mocking. "Or is it more than work now? We have heard rumors that you have gotten awfully friendly with that orc." Callum kept his expression neutral. "My relationship with Grenna is none of your concern. It is our concern when decent folk have to watch a human debase himself with a monster." The man spat on the ground near Callum's feet. "You are a disgrace to your kind. And you are a bitter fool clinging to hatred because you have nothing else to give your life meaning," Callum said coldly. "Now move aside." He tried to step past them, but one of the other men grabbed his arm, and suddenly fists were flying. Callum got in a few good hits, his training from the war coming back to him, but he was outnumbered and the men were determined. By the time other townspeople intervened to break up the fight, Callum had a split lip, a bruised jaw, and several painful ribs. The same merchant who had sold him fabric months ago helped him gather his scattered purchases, her expression sympathetic. "You should be more careful," she said quietly. "Those men are dangerous and they have friends. If you keep provoking them, I am not provoking anyone. I am simply living my life. I know, but sometimes that is provocation enough." She pressed a small jar of salve into his hands. "For the bruises, and Callum, not everyone in Millhaven feels the way those men do. Some of us remember the kindness Grenna's father showed us, and we do not forget." Callum thanked her and made his way back to the farm, each step sending jolts of pain through his ribs. He was dreading having to explain what had happened to Grenna, but when he arrived, she took one look at him, and her expression went from concern to fury in an instant. "Who did this?" she demanded, her hands gentle as she examined his injuries despite the anger in her voice. "It does not matter. I gave as good as I got. Callum," he sighed and told her about the confrontation, watching as her jaw tightened and her hands clenched into fists. "I am all right, Grenna, truly. It is just bruises." "This is my fault," she said, her voice raw. "If we had not gotten close, if I had kept my distance, do not," Callum interrupted, catching her hand. "Do not blame yourself for the hatred of others." Those men are responsible for their own actions, not you, and I would take a dozen beatings if it meant I could still have us. Grenna's eyes were wet, and she pulled him into a careful embrace, mindful of his injuries. I cannot lose you, she whispered against his hair. I will not. You will not lose me, Callum promised. I am not going anywhere. But even as he said the words, a knot of worry formed in his chest. The men in Millhaven were escalating, and he feared that words and fists would not be the end of it. He said nothing of this to Grenna, not wanting to add to her worry, but he found himself lying awake at night listening for sounds of trouble, his body tense with vigilance. His fears proved justified 2 weeks later when he woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. He bolted upright, his ribs protesting, and looked out the small window of his loft to see flames licking at the far corner of the barn. For one frozen moment, he could not move, could not think, and then training and instinct kicked in, and he was scrambling down the ladder, shouting for Grenna. She was already awake, already running toward the barn with buckets, and together they fought the fire with desperate intensity. The animals were screaming, terrified by the smoke and heat, and Callum threw open the stall doors, driving them out into the snowy yard while Grenna attacked the flames with water from the well. Other sections of the barn were catching now, and Callum knew with sick certainty that they were going to lose the building, but they had to try, had to save what they could. It was only when the roof began to collapse that Grenna grabbed his arm and dragged him back, both of them coughing and covered in soot. They stood in the yard and watched the barn burn, the heat of it a stark contrast to the freezing night air, and Callum felt rage and grief warring in his chest. The animals were safe, scattered across the snowy fields but alive, and the fire had not spread to the farmhouse or the other outbuildings, but the barn was gone, and with it months of stored hay, grain, and equipment. Arson, Grenna said, her voice flat. Someone set this deliberately. Callum wanted to deny it, but he could not. The fire had started in a corner far from any heat source, and there was no natural explanation for it. The men from town, he said, and it was not a question. Grenna nodded slowly, her expression cold and hard. They want to drive me out. They have wanted it since my father died, and now they are willing to destroy everything to achieve it. We will rebuild, Callum said fiercely. We will rebuild the barn, replace what was lost, and we will not let them win. Callum, look at what they have done. Look at what they are willing to do. Grenna turned to him, and in the firelight her amber eyes were shadowed with something that looked like despair. I will not ask you to sacrifice everything for me. You should leave, go somewhere safe, somewhere you can build a life without this constant threat. I am not leaving you, Callum said, and he reached out to cup her face with both hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. I love you, Grenna. I love this farm, this life we are building together. If staying means facing down the hatred of ignorant men, then that is what I will do. But I am not leaving. Grenna's breath hitched, and then she was kissing him, fierce and desperate, and Callum kissed her back with all the emotion that had been building inside him for months. They broke apart only when the need for air became too great, and they stood forehead to forehead, breathing hard. I love you, Grenna said, her voice shaking. I love you so much it terrifies me. I know, Callum said softly. I feel the same. They spent the rest of the night rounding up the scattered animals and securing them in a makeshift shelter, and when dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of the barn, they stood together and surveyed the damage with grim determination. They would rebuild, Callum promised himself. They would survive this, and they would be stronger for it. Word of the fire spread quickly, and to Callum's surprise, help arrived within days. The fabric merchant from Millhaven came with her husband, bringing lumber and tools. Other families followed, People who had known Grenna's father and remembered his kindness. People who were ashamed of what had been done in their town's name. Not everyone was supportive, and there were still those who looked at Callum and Grenna with disgust, but there were enough decent people that the work progressed steadily. The rebuilding took weeks, but the new barn that rose from the ashes was sturdy and well made, a testament to the community that had come together to create it. Grenna was quiet through much of the process, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected support, and Callum saw her blink back tears more than once as neighbors worked alongside her without complaint. On the day the barn was finished, Grenna prepared a feast for everyone who had helped, and the farmhouse and yard were filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. Callum moved through the crowd, offering thanks and accepting congratulations, and he felt a swell of cautious hope that perhaps things were changing, that perhaps there was room for him and Grenna to have a life together after all. That night, after the guests had gone and they were cleaning up the remnants of the celebration, Grenna took his hand and led him outside. The sky was clear and filled with stars, and the air was cold enough to make their breath mist, but Callum barely noticed. All his attention was focused on Grenna, on the nervous hope in her eyes. "I have been thinking," she said slowly, "about us, about what we want for the future." "What have you been thinking?" Callum asked, his heart racing. "I want you to stay, not as my employee but as my partner in all things. I want to build this life together, face whatever comes together." She paused, then added, "I want you to be my husband if you will have me." Callum felt as though his heart might burst from his chest. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am. I know it will not be easy, that there will be people who oppose us, but I do not care anymore. You have shown me that there is goodness and courage in this world, and I want to spend my life with you." Grenna's voice dropped to a whisper. "So yes, Callum Quinn, I am asking you to marry me." Callum pulled her into his arms, laughing with pure joy. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in early spring, a simple ceremony conducted by a traveling priest who had once served in the war and had no prejudice against orcs. The same neighbors who had helped rebuild the barn attended, along with a few others from surrounding farms who had heard the story and wanted to show their support. It was not a grand affair, but it was filled with genuine warmth and happiness, and when Callum and Grenna exchanged vows, he saw tears in the eyes of more than one guest. The fabric merchant gifted them a beautiful quilt she had made herself, and her husband gave Callum a sturdy knife with a carved handle. Others brought food, tools, seeds for the spring planting, and Grenna accepted each gift with quiet gratitude, her hand firmly clasped in Callum's. That night, alone in the farmhouse that was now truly their home, Callum and Grenna consummated their marriage with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. Afterwards, lying tangled together in the bed they now shared, Callum traced idle patterns on Grenna's skin and marveled at how far he had come from the desperate, starving man who had answered a notice on a board months ago. "What are you thinking?" Grenna asked, her voice drowsy. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest man alive," Callum said honestly. "I came here with nothing, expecting only a few coins and a meal, and instead I found you. I found a home, a purpose, a future. Everything I could ever want." Grenna shifted to look at him, her amber eyes soft in the candlelight. "I feel the same. I was so alone before you came, so convinced that I would spend the rest of my life isolated and unloved. You changed everything, Callum. You gave me hope." "We gave each other hope," Callum corrected gently. "And we will keep giving it to each other, for as long as we both live." Grenna smiled and kissed him softly, and they held each other as the candle burned low and eventually guttered out, leaving them in warm darkness. The months that followed brought new challenges and new joys. Spring planting kept them busy from dawn until dusk, and Callum learned the rhythms of the farm in a new season, working alongside his wife with a sense of rightness that still sometimes surprised him. Grenna proved to be an excellent teacher, patient when he made mistakes and generous with praise when he succeeded, and their partnership deepened with each passing day. There were still those in Millhaven who disapproved of their marriage, who muttered darkly when they saw Callum and Grenna together in town, but the support they had received from their neighbors had shifted the balance. The men who had burned the barn were quietly shunned by many in the community, and while Callum doubted they would ever face formal justice, the social consequences were real and meaningful. In late spring, Grenna discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Callum with a complex mixture of joy, terror, and fierce protectiveness. He had not allowed himself to think too much about children, aware that such things were uncertain at best, but now that it was a reality, he found himself overwhelmed with emotion. Grenna seemed equally stunned, and they spent an entire evening simply holding each other and talking about what this meant, what kind of parents they wanted to be, what kind of world they wanted to build for their child. "There will be challenges," Grenna said quietly. "A half-orc child, born to a union that many will see as unnatural. They will face prejudice from both humans and orcs. Then we will teach them to be strong," Callum said firmly. "We will teach them that their heritage is something to be proud of, that they are loved beyond measure, and that the opinions of small-minded fools do not define their worth." Grenna's eyes filled with tears, and she kissed him with a tenderness that made his throat tight. "You are going to be an excellent father, and you will be an amazing mother," Callum replied. "Our child is lucky to have you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer, and Callum found himself constantly amazed by the changes in Grenna's body, the visible evidence of the life they had created together. He became fiercely protective, insisting that she not overwork herself despite her protests that she was perfectly capable, and they compromised by adjusting their division of labor to accommodate her growing fatigue. In autumn, as the leaves turned gold and red and the air grew crisp, Grenna went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Callum feared he might lose her, but the midwife they had hired was skilled and calm, and after nearly a full day of labor, their daughter was born. She was perfect, with green-tinged skin a shade lighter than Grenna's, small tusks that would grow more prominent with time, and eyes the same warm brown as Callum's. When the midwife placed her in Callum's arms, he felt something in his chest crack open, a love so intense it was almost painful. "She is beautiful," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She is ours," Grenna said from the bed, her voice exhausted but filled with wonder. "Our daughter." They named her Lyra after Callum's mother, and she became the center of their world. The neighbors who had supported them through the rebuilding and the wedding came to meet the baby, bringing gifts and congratulations, and Callum saw more than one hardened farmer melt at the sight of Lyra's tiny face. The fabric merchant, who had become a good friend, knitted blankets and clothing, and her husband carved a beautiful cradle that became one of Callum and Grenna's most treasured possessions. Not everyone was supportive, of course. There were still those who looked at Lyra with disgust or pity, who whispered that she was an abomination, a creature that should never have been born. But Callum and Grenna faced these reactions with the same quiet dignity they had shown in the face of all opposition, and they focused on building a life filled with love and security for their daughter. As Lyra grew from an infant to a toddler, Callum watched with pride as she displayed a perfect blend of her parents' best qualities. She had Grenna's strength and determination, her ability to focus intently on tasks, but also Callum's gentleness and his love of storytelling. She was bright and curious, constantly exploring her world with fearless enthusiasm, and both parents delighted in her discoveries. The farm prospered under their joint management, and they were able to expand their holdings, purchasing additional land and livestock. Callum proved to have a talent for breeding and training horses, while Grenna's skills in metalwork and carpentry brought in additional income. They worked hard, but they also made time for rest and enjoyment, for quiet evenings by the fire and lazy summer afternoons by the river. 2 years after Lyra's birth, Grenna became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, as was the birth. Their son, whom they named Garrett after Grenna's father, was born healthy and strong, with features that favored his mother even more than Lyra's did. He was a happy, placid baby who rarely fussed, and Lyra adored him from the moment she met him, insisting on helping with everything from feeding to changing. Callum often found himself pausing in his work to simply watch his family, overcome with gratitude for the life they had built together. There were still challenges, still moments when prejudice reared its ugly head, but they faced everything together, united in their love and commitment to each other and to their children. One evening in late autumn, when Lyra was 4 and Garrett was 2, Callum and Grenna sat on the porch of their farmhouse, watching the sun set over the fields they had planted together. The children were inside, being watched by a teenage girl from a neighboring farm who sometimes helped out, and for a rare moment, Callum and Grenna had time alone together. "You remember the day you arrived here?" Grenna asked, her hand finding his. "I do. I was starving, desperate, convinced that I would never find a place where I belonged." Callum squeezed her hand gently. "I had no idea that answering that notice would change my entire life. I almost did not post it," Grenna admitted. "I told myself that no one would answer, that I was foolish to hope. And then you appeared, looking half dead but determined to work, and I thought perhaps there was still some good in the world." "There is good in the world," Callum said softly. "We prove it every day, just by choosing to love each other, to build this life together." Grenna leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to appear. Somewhere inside the house, Lyra laughed at something, the sound bright and joyful, and Callum felt his heart swell with contentment. "I would not change anything," Grenna said suddenly. "Not the hardships, not the pain, not the struggle, because all of it led us here to this moment, to this life." "Neither would I," Callum agreed. "You paid me double to work your farm, Grenna, but what you actually gave me was worth infinitely more. You gave me love, family, purpose. You gave me everything." Grenna turned to kiss him, soft and sweet, and when they pulled apart, she was smiling. "We gave each other everything, and we will keep giving, keep building for as long as we have." "For as long as we have," Callum echoed, and he pulled her close, holding her as the night deepened around them and their children's laughter drifted out from the warm, lit windows of the home they had made together. In the years that followed, the Quinn farm became known throughout the region not just for the quality of its goods but for the family that ran it. Callum and Grenna's marriage stood as proof that love could transcend the boundaries of species and culture, and while there were still those who disapproved, their children grew up surrounded by a community that, for the most part, accepted and even celebrated their family. Lyra and Garrett were joined by 2 more siblings, twins named Kasia and Marcus, and the farmhouse rang with the noise and chaos of a large, loving family. Callum taught all his children to read and write, to work hard and treat others with respect regardless of their race or background. Grenna taught them the skills her father had passed to her, the metalwork and carpentry that had sustained the farm through difficult times, and she made sure they understood the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. As Callum grew older, his hair going gray and his face acquiring lines earned through years of laughter and hard work, he never lost his sense of wonder at the life he had been given. He and Grenna would sometimes stand together on the hill where she had first spoken to him of her father's wisdom, looking out over the land they had built together. And in those moments, Callum felt a peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. The farm passed eventually to their children, who carried on the traditions their parents had established, and the Quinn name became synonymous with integrity, quality, and the courage to love across boundaries. Callum and Grenna lived to see grandchildren, their legacy secured not just in land and buildings, but in the hearts of those they had raised. When Callum finally passed, it was in his sleep, with Grenna beside him in the bed they had shared for decades, and his last thought was one of gratitude for the starving, desperate day when he had answered a simple notice and found everything he had ever wanted. Grenna followed him not long after, her fierce heart finally giving out, and they were buried side by side on the hill overlooking their farm, two souls who had defied the world to be together. Their children placed a simple stone marker over their graves, inscribed with words that Callum had once spoken to Grenna on a snowy day long ago. "We give each other everything." And in the years that followed, when descendants of Callum and Grenna looked at that stone and remembered the story of how their family began, they understood the truth of those words and the power of love to transform even the most desperate of circumstances into something beautiful and enduring. The farm still stands, generations later, a testament to what can be built when two people choose to see past fear and prejudice to the person beneath. And on quiet evenings when the wind blows just right through the fields, some say you can still feel the presence of Callum and Grenna, watching over the land they loved and the family they created, their story a reminder that the greatest treasures are often found in the most unexpected places, and that love, true love, is worth fighting for no matter the cost.